Full story. A mother's heartbreaking decision to leave her daughter. Why did she do it? Welcome to Stories TH. In today's, we will dive deep into the emotional journey of Grace, a woman who spent her life sacrificing for her family. After years of being taken for granted, Grace is forced to make a tough decision that will change everything. If you can relate to Grace's struggle or just want to hear an inspiring story of resilience, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Stories TH. Join us for more life-changing stories. Introduction to the chaos. Grace had never imagined that a simple grocery shopping trip would turn her life upside down. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. She had promised her daughter, Emily, that she would take Lucas, her young grandson, to the store. At just 5 years old, Lucas was full of energy and questions, always asking about the world around him. Grace enjoyed these little moments with him, even though they often wore her out. But today was different. They had just entered the crosswalk when, out of nowhere, a car lost control. Grace saw it coming too late, its tires screeching on the pavement as it barreled toward them. Panic rose in her chest, but before she could think, instinct kicked in. Without hesitation, she threw herself in front of Lucas, her body colliding with the car's front bumper. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Grace felt the sharp impact of the crash as her back buckled beneath her. The searing pain coursed through her body, but she didn't care. All that mattered was Lucas. He was still standing beside her, unharmed. She had done what she could to shield him, to save him from the danger that had come too quickly. The car finally came to a screeching halt, but the damage had been done. She collapsed to the pavement, unable to move, her breath shallow and erratic. Lucas, terrified, began crying, his tiny voice calling out to her. "Grandma, are you okay?" The words were filled with fear, and it shattered Grace's heart. She tried to reassure him, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You're safe." Grace couldn't see clearly through the haze of pain and the blur of her vision. The last thing she remembered was hearing sirens in the distance before the world around her went black. When she awoke, she was lying in a hospital bed. The sterile white walls, the beeping machines, and the soft murmur of voices filled the room. Her back was on fire, each movement sending waves of excruciating pain through her body. She winced, trying to sit up, but a nurse quickly stopped her. "You need to rest, Grace. You've been through a lot," the nurse said softly. Her mind was foggy as the events of the accident rushed back. But the pain in her back, the throbbing sensation in her ribs, and the tightness in her chest were all-consuming. She tried to focus on the sound of Lucas's voice, hoping to hear him say he was okay. But then, the door opened, and Grace's daughter, Emily, stormed into the room, her face twisted in anger. She didn't greet her mother or offer any comforting words. Instead, she launched into a tirade. "Mom, what the hell were you thinking? You can't even watch over my son properly? You could have killed him." Emily's voice was sharp, filled with fury, her words cutting through the air like daggers. Grace's heart sank. She had expected worry, concern, maybe even a hug. But not this. Not anger. "Emily, please," Grace whispered, but the words barely escaped her lips. Her back was burning, and she could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She wanted to explain, to tell Emily that she had done what any grandmother would have done in that situation, but the words wouldn't come. Before she could say anything more, Emily's mother-in-law, Lydia, barged into the room. Lydia, always the one to speak her mind without any filter, added her voice to the growing chaos. "I told you she wasn't fit to watch him. If anything happened to my grandson, I'd make sure you pay for it." Lydia snapped, her voice cold and dismissive. It felt like salt was being rubbed into an already gaping wound. Grace lay there in stunned silence, feeling utterly helpless. She had given everything for her family, her time, her energy, her love, and now, in the moment she needed them most, all she received was criticism. The tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wasn't going to let them see her break. Not yet. As the chaos in the room continued, the doctor finally arrived, pushing past Emily and Lydia with a clipped tone. He explained that Grace had suffered a significant injury to her back and that she would need surgery. He also mentioned that Lucas had only minor scrapes but was otherwise unharmed. Yet, as the doctor spoke, Emily barely seemed to register his words. Her focus remained on the hospital bills and how Grace's injury would affect her own life. "Mom, you need to get better quickly. I can't handle this on my own," Emily said, her voice tinged with impatience. "I'm already struggling with work and taking care of Benny. And now you've put me in this situation." Grace's heart clenched as she listened to her daughter's words. She had spent the past few years living with Emily and Andrew, helping out with everything from cooking and cleaning to babysitting. Grace had sacrificed her own comfort to care for her family. Yet now, instead of gratitude, all she received was resentment and blame. The pain in her body seemed to intensify as the weight of the situation hit her all at once. For years, she had been the one to give, to care, to help, and now it felt like there was nothing left. Her own daughter was more concerned about her own life than the mother who had always been there for her. Grace closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, trying to silence the voice inside her head that screamed, "Why have you let this happen? Why did you allow yourself to be used like this?" But she couldn't block it out. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Maybe it was time for Grace to start living for herself. The years of sacrifice, of selflessness, had drained her. And now, in this moment of weakness and pain, she realized that she had been living for others for too long. As the doctor wheeled her off to surgery, Grace made a silent promise to herself. When she recovered, things would be different. She would stop living in the shadows of others' expectations. She would reclaim her own life. The anesthesia began to take hold, and as Grace slipped into unconsciousness, the chaos in the room seemed to fade away. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt a sense of peace knowing that, somehow, this moment of pain might just be the catalyst for change. The arrival of the family. Grace lay in the sterile hospital bed, the sharp sting of pain radiating from her back and ribs. Every breath felt like it was being drawn through broken glass. The overwhelming weight of the accident and the chaos that had followed made it hard for her to focus. She couldn't remember how long she had been here, or when the doctors had come in. All she knew was that her body was a battlefield of agony, and her mind felt clouded by confusion and betrayal. The sound of hurried footsteps outside the room caught her attention, and then the door swung open. Her daughter, Emily, rushed in, her face pale and drawn with worry. But instead of rushing to her mother's side, instead of offering comfort or even a word of concern, Emily bypassed Grace entirely. Her eyes were locked on her son, Lucas, who had been sitting in the corner, his face still streaked with tears from the terrifying ordeal. "Lucas, are you all right?" Emily's voice was panicked, her words rushing out in a frantic stream. "We need to get you checked, honey. Just a few scrapes, right? We'll have the doctor look at them. Make sure you're fine." Grace's heart sank as she watched her daughter completely ignore her. Emily's frantic movements, the urgency in her voice, none of it was directed toward Grace. The woman who had just thrown herself in front of a car to protect her grandson, the woman who had been in agonizing pain and fear, now lay abandoned in the hospital bed, a mere afterthought in the eyes of her own child. The pain in Grace's chest was not just physical, it was a deep, aching sorrow. She had spent her entire life supporting Emily, nurturing her, raising her, and making sacrifices, big and small. Yet now, in this moment, when she was at her most vulnerable, Emily couldn't even spare her a glance. Grace tried to sit up, her breath catching in her throat as she attempted to push through the pain. "Emily, I'm all right," she whispered, hoping her daughter would hear her, hoping for some acknowledgement. But Emily's response was distant, as if she hadn't even heard her. "Just a minute, Mom," Emily called over her shoulder as she moved toward the doctor, still ignoring her mother's presence. She was too focused on Lucas, who had begun to calm down, though his small body still trembled. The mother's concern was not for Grace, not even for her own mother, who had nearly died shielding her son from harm. No, all of Emily's attention was on Lucas. And as Grace lay there, struggling to breathe through the pain, she heard another voice, one that was even colder than Emily's. The sharp, uninvited voice of Lydia, Emily's mother-in-law, cut through the air like a knife. Well, what do we have here?" Lydia's tone was scathing, dripping with disdain as she walked into the room, her eyes immediately fixing on Grace. "Can't even take care of a child? You nearly got him killed, Grace. What kind of grandmother are you?" Grace blinked slowly, the sting of Lydia's words adding to the rawness of her physical pain. The woman she had always tried to get along with, the woman who had never really hidden her opinions about Grace, now stood before her with the same sharp eyes, the same judgmental tone. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was raw, the words caught in her chest. I tried to protect him. Grace's voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper, but Lydia wasn't listening. She never had. Protect him. Lydia scoffed. If you'd been more careful, if you weren't so careless, this wouldn't have happened. My grandson could have been seriously hurt. And you, what would you have done then? Let him get it. Lydia's words were venomous, as if Grace had failed in some unspoken way, as though all the love she had given to her family for years meant nothing in the face of this one accident. Grace closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She had done everything she could. She had thrown herself in front of Lucas, despite the fear in her own heart, despite the weight of the car bearing down on them. But now, it seemed, none of that mattered. Her body was shaking, not just from the pain but from the crushing weight of this emotional blow. She thought she had raised Emily to be better than this, to recognize sacrifice and love, to understand that life wasn't just about taking, it was about giving. But here Emily was, distancing herself from her own mother, taking no responsibility for her actions, and instead pouring all her frustration onto the one person who had always given her everything. Mom, are you listening to me? Emily's voice rang out sharply from the other side of the room. Grace turned her head slightly, trying to focus through the fog of pain, but Emily's tone was different now, less frantic, more detached. Grace watched as Emily spoke to the doctor, asking about Lucas's checkup, making arrangements for his care as if Grace herself wasn't even there. She wanted to scream, to demand attention, to tell Emily how much she had hurt her. But the words stuck in her throat, suffocated by the tears she refused to shed. Finally, Emily turned back to her. Her face was tight, her brow furrowed in concern, but for Lucas, not for Grace. Don't worry, Mom. I'll handle everything, she said, before walking out of the room with Lucas, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts in the stillness of the hospital. Grace's heart was heavy. She didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped being Emily's mother and had become a burden. She had given so much of herself, her time, her money, and her energy to Emily's family over the years. But now, she felt like a stranger in her own life. The harsh words of Lydia echoed in her mind, but it was the silence from Emily that hurt the most. The absence of empathy, the refusal to even acknowledge Grace's suffering, was the greatest betrayal of all. As the room grew quieter, Grace closed her eyes and let the tears fall. Not for the physical pain, but for the deep, aching pain of realizing that she had been giving everything to people who never truly saw her. She had poured her heart into her family, and yet, in the end, it felt like it had all been for nothing. It was in this moment that Grace realized something she had been living for others for far too long. She had put her own needs on the back burner, hoping that, one day, her love and sacrifices would be enough to make her family appreciate her. But now, lying alone in this hospital bed, it became painfully clear. She could no longer live for them. She had to live for herself. Grace's body ached, but it was the ache in her heart that would take longer to heal. The cutting words. Grace could feel the weight of her body pressing into the hospital bed, every inch of her aching in ways she had never imagined. Her back throbbed with a pain so sharp it felt as if her spine was being torn apart. The numbness from the shock of the accident had begun to fade, replaced by an all-encompassing agony. The pressure in her chest made it hard to breathe, and the frantic beating of her heart only seemed to worsen her discomfort. Yet, it wasn't just her physical pain that gnawed at her soul, it was the emotional hurt, the realization that her family had become strangers to her in this moment. The doctor had just entered, his expression grave, his movements efficient but gentle. He took one look at Grace's injuries and spoke in a steady, professional tone. We need to take you in for surgery right away. You've sustained some serious damage. It's important we act quickly to avoid complications. Grace barely registered his words. She could only focus on the pain, the sharp burning sensation that coursed through her body as she struggled to keep her breathing steady. Her hand gripped the edge of the bed, the cold metal offering some form of stability in the midst of chaos. The doctor continued speaking, preparing her for what was to come, but Grace couldn't focus on anything beyond the searing sensation in her back. Her daughter, Emily, stood at the foot of the bed. The same daughter who, not long ago, had been the little girl Grace had nurtured, protected, and cherished. The same daughter she had given up so much for. But now, as Emily stood there was no warmth in her eyes. No tenderness. Just get her treated, Doc, Emily said, her voice flat, as if Grace were nothing more than a task to be checked off. She'll be fine. Let's focus on Lucas. He's the one who really matters here. Grace's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a slap. She blinked hard, trying to clear the fog that had clouded her vision. For a moment, the world around her seemed to freeze. The pain in her body, the cold air in the room, the beeping of machines, everything seemed to fade into the background as Emily's dismissive tone echoed in her mind. "Mom can wait," Emily had muttered, her voice dismissive, barely above a whisper. She didn't even look at Grace as she spoke. The woman who had carried her for 9 months, who had sacrificed everything to give her a better life, was now being treated as if she were a mere inconvenience, a bother in the midst of Emily's far more important concerns. Grace's heart dropped into her stomach. The emotional blow was far sharper than the physical pain. She had been a devoted mother. She had spent her life giving, never asking for anything in return. She had raised Emily with love, with everything she had. But now, in her most vulnerable moment, Emily could barely spare her a second of genuine concern. Lucas, her grandson, was the center of Emily's world, as if Grace no longer mattered. The overwhelming realization struck Grace like a ton of bricks. Had she really lived her whole life for them? For her family? She had spent every moment dedicated to their needs, their wants, never once pausing to think about herself. She had given up her freedom, her peace, and her independence, always believing that one day, her sacrifices would be acknowledged, that one day, Emily would see what she had done for her. But now, in this moment of crisis, it was clear that all those years of giving had been in vain. "Mom." Emily's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and insistent. "I said you'll be fine. Just get the surgery done, okay? You can rest after." Grace's heart wrenched at the coldness in Emily's voice. There was no trace of affection, no trace of the love she had once felt for her mother. Grace looked at Emily, trying to hold her gaze, but her daughter's eyes were focused elsewhere. Her attention divided between Grace and the concern for Lucas, who was now sitting quietly on a nearby chair, his little body still trembling from the shock. The sting of those words was unbearable, and yet, there was something freeing about them. As the reality of the situation settled in, Grace felt a sense of clarity she had never experienced before. Emily was no longer the little girl she had nurtured and raised. She was an adult, with her own life, her own priorities. And while Grace had always believed that family meant unconditional love and sacrifice, the truth was that Emily had grown up into someone who saw those sacrifices as expectations, as entitlements. Grace realized then that she had spent so many years living for others, that she had forgotten how to live for herself. She had poured all her energy into taking care of others, hoping that one day it would be returned. But now, lying in that hospital bed, the truth was undeniable. No one could love or care for her the way she had loved and cared for them. No one could value her as she had valued them. Her thoughts were interrupted as the doctor and nurse began to prepare her for surgery. The nurse gently adjusted her fore, making sure everything was set. Grace's mind raced. Her back was on fire, her body felt broken, but something in her stirred. It wasn't just the physical pain anymore, it was the realization that her life could no longer be lived for anyone else. She had given everything she had to her family, and now it was time to focus on herself. The thought was terrifying and liberating at the same time. For the first time, she could see the road ahead, clear and unmarked. She had spent so many years trying to be everything for everyone else, trying to fit herself into the mold of the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother. But that mold had broken, and now Grace was left with only herself. She wasn't sure what came next. She didn't know what it would mean to live for herself, to prioritize her own needs, but she knew that this surgery was just the beginning. As the doctor wheeled her toward the operating room, Grace closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. This was it, the start of a new chapter in her life. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was no longer afraid. She was ready to live, not for anyone else, but for herself. The descent into disrespect. Grace's world remained heavy with pain, but it wasn't just the physical suffering that plagued her as she lay in that sterile hospital bed. The haze of anesthesia was wearing off, and in its place, the sharp clarity of her reality hit her like a tidal wave. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft rustle of nurses moving about. As her eyes fluttered open, she briefly registered the unfamiliar room and the dim light filtering through the blinds. It took her a moment to remember where she was, but then it all came rushing back: an accident, a shattered back, and the betrayal that was slowly seeping into her very soul. She turned her head slightly, her body ached with every subtle movement. But there was something more, something that felt worse than the pain itself. In the bed next to hers, a woman in her 40s was sleeping peacefully, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest showing no signs of the chaos that had engulfed Grace's life. The woman's calmness contrasted with Grace's frantic thoughts. In another time, in a different world, it could have been her lying there, at peace, simply recovering. But here she was, trapped in this hospital room, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the harsh reality of her present. A small sigh escaped her lips as she tried to shift her focus from the stranger in the bed to her own situation. It wasn't the pain that had her heart racing now, it was the dread of the conversation she knew was coming. It had been hours since the surgery, and the doctor had told her that the procedure had gone well. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the constant sting of disrespect that had been thrust upon her in the hours since the accident. It didn't take long for Lydia, Emily's mother-in-law, to appear at her bedside, her tone as sharp as a knife. Why is she acting like the victim? Lydia scoffed, not even bothering to acknowledge Grace as she lay there, barely able to move. You let my grandson get hurt. Now you want sympathy? Grace's eyes stung with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she turned her head toward the wall, hoping the tears would stay hidden from the woman who had never once treated her with kindness. She had always been so quick to judge, so eager to blame Grace for anything that went wrong. The words cut deeper than any physical injury ever could. Lydia continued her rant, completely oblivious to Grace's suffering, her harsh words filling the space between them. You should have been more careful with Lucas. You should have done better. But no, you get yourself hurt and expect us to pity you. Lydia huffed in disdain, and, without another word, she walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway like a final judgment. But it wasn't just Lydia's cruelty that was eating away at Grace's dignity, it was Emily's dismissive attitude as well. Moments after Lydia left, Emily entered the room, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, but there was no softness in her eyes. No compassion, no warmth, nothing that resembled the daughter Grace had once known. Emily didn't ask how she was feeling or express concern for her well-being. Instead, she approached the bed with an air of frustration, her voice low but cutting. Mom, just heal quickly, Emily said, barely glancing at Grace as she spoke. We need help with Lucas. No time for this drama. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. The woman she had spent her whole life nurturing, the child she had raised with so much love, was now treating her with the same cold indifference that Lydia had just displayed. Grace's heart tightened in her chest, and the weight of it all of the years spent sacrificing everything for her daughter, for her family, felt like it might crush her. The words stung in a way that was more painful than the incision on her back. Emily wasn't just dismissing her physical pain, she was dismissing everything Grace had ever done for her. The sleepless nights, the endless hours of sacrifice, the years spent caring for Lucas, all of it now meant nothing. Emily's voice had no love in it, no concern for the woman who had given her everything. It was just a demand, a plea for Grace to heal quickly so that she could continue playing the role she had been cast into for the past few years, unseen, unimportant, and most of all, dispensable. Mom, we don't have time for your drama, Emily repeated, her tone sharp, as if she were speaking to a child who couldn't understand the urgency of the situation. Grace's throat tightened, and she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had spent her entire life doing everything for Emily. She had moved into their home to help with the baby, cooked every meal, cleaned every dish, and picked up every dropped toy. She had given up her independence, her quiet life, her peace, all for the sake of family. But now, as she lay here, vulnerable and broken, she was nothing more than a burden, an inconvenience, a person who had overstayed her welcome. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had allowed herself to become nothing more than a servant, a caretaker with no value beyond the work she could provide. And Emily, the daughter she had always adored, had become a woman who no longer saw her mother as a person, but as a tool to be used, a resource to be exploited. Mom, just heal quickly, Emily repeated, her voice edged with impatience. We can't afford any more setbacks. Grace's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She couldn't find the words to express the hurt, the betrayal, the crushing weight of it all. Instead, she lay there, trying to focus on her breathing, trying to block out the cruel words that were filling the room. But it was hard, so hard to ignore the coldness that had replaced the warmth of her daughter's love. The silence between them spoke volumes, louder than any words could ever convey. As Emily left the room, Grace closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The pain in her back was unbearable, but it was the pain in her heart that truly shattered her. She had given everything for this family, and now, in her most vulnerable moment, she was met with nothing but indifference and contempt. But even as the hurt swirled within her, Grace felt a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in years. It was small, fragile, but it was there. It was the beginning of something new. A realization that she could no longer live for others, that she could no longer be the person who sacrificed everything without asking for anything in return. The road ahead was uncertain, but Grace knew one thing for sure. It was time to stop being invisible, time to stop letting her family walk all over her. For the first time, Grace considered the possibility of living for herself. A heartbreaking demand. Grace lay in the hospital bed, her body still weak from surgery, but it wasn't the physical pain that gnawed at her soul. It was the emotional devastation that had taken root. She had spent years caring for Emily, doing everything a mother could to ensure her daughter's happiness and security, yet here she was, abandoned, disrespected, and now, at the mercy of the very person she had raised. The door creaked open, and Emily walked in. Her face was drawn, weary from the events of the past few days, but there was something different in her expression, something cold, calculating. Grace tried to focus on her daughter, but all she could think of was the hurt that had been building between them over the years. The long hours spent babysitting Lucas, the meals prepared with no thanks, the laundry folded without a word of appreciation. All of it had led to this moment, a daughter who was now demanding something from her mother. "Mom," Emily said, her voice tight, as if every word were carefully chosen. "If you really want to leave, hand over the card." She didn't even call it Grace's pension card, but the card, as if it were some object that could be passed from one hand to the other without any consideration for the history behind it. Grace's chest tightened, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Emily's eyes were cold, filled with a kind of determination that chilled Grace to the bone. There was no love in them, no care, only a demand that felt like it had been years in the making. After everything Grace had done for her, after all the sacrifices she had made to ensure Emily's happiness and well-being, this was the price. "You want your freedom, right?" Emily continued, her voice dripping with entitlement. "Then give me the card, and you can go. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Grace felt a rush of anger, and anger that she had held in for years, quietly swallowed in the name of family, in the name of love. Her throat tightened, her hands clenched the sheets as she struggled to keep her composure. The room felt like it was closing in on her, and yet, despite the fury coursing through her veins, all she could do was nod. It was as if the weight of all the years of sacrifice, all the moments she had spent pouring herself into her family, had culminated in this one heartbreaking demand. The pension she had worked so hard for, the small bit of security she had managed to accumulate after a lifetime of toil, was now being held up as a bargaining chip, a tool to manipulate her into leaving. Emily wasn't offering her freedom out of love or care. She was using it as a form of control. Grace swallowed hard, the anger inside her slowly turning into something colder, something more painful. She had never imagined it would come to this, to the point where her daughter saw her not as a mother, but as an inconvenience. The realization hit her with a force that almost knocked the wind out of her. Emily no longer saw her as a person with her own life, her own desires, her own worth. She was just a source of financial support, a means to an end. The rage swelled inside her, but Grace did not allow it to explode. Instead, she did something she had never expected herself to do. With trembling hands, she reached for her purse, the familiar old leather bag that had always been there for her, safeguarding her things, protecting her privacy. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of the cards she had carried for years, the symbols of her independence. One by one, she pulled them out and, without a word, handed Emily the pension card. Emily's eyes flickered with something triumph, perhaps. She took the card from Grace's hand, and a satisfied smile slowly spread across her face. In that moment, Grace saw the daughter she had once known disappear completely. This was not the woman she had raised, this cold, calculating stranger standing before her, clutching the card as if it were the key to her own happiness. For a moment, everything seemed still. Grace's heart felt like it was shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces, each one heavier than the last. But there was no fight left in her. She had fought for years to be seen, to be appreciated, to be loved. But now, she realized, that battle was over. She had lost. Emily had won. And Grace was left standing in the wreckage of a relationship that had once meant everything. Emily's face lit up as if she had just scored a victory, her voice a little too light, a little too eager as she tucked the card into her pocket. "Thanks, Mom," she said, her tone almost sarcastic in its cheerfulness. "I'll make sure to take care of everything now." Grace watched her daughter turn and leave the room, her back straight and her step brisk, as though she had just accomplished something great. But Grace knew the truth. There was no victory here, no triumph. There was only the emptiness that came from realizing that the love and sacrifice she had poured into Emily had been used as leverage, manipulated into something bitter and hollow. As Emily disappeared from view, Grace closed her eyes and let the tears fall, tears not just for the pain in her body, but for the heartache of knowing that she had spent so many years giving, loving, and supporting, only to have it all turned against her. The anger still simmered within her, but now it was something different, something less consuming. Grace realized something in that moment. She had spent her entire life living for others, for her family, for her children, always putting their needs above her own. But now, at the edge of everything, at the very brink of losing herself, she understood that she could no longer live that way. She had spent so long living for Emily, for everyone else, that she had forgotten what it meant to live for herself. And so, in that quiet, lonely moment, as the door clicked shut behind Emily, Grace made a vow to herself. She would not be the pawn in anyone's game any longer. She would reclaim her life, her dignity, and her independence. The time had come for Grace to start living for Grace. And no matter how broken her heart was, no matter how many pieces of herself she had to rebuild, she knew that this would be the first step toward her own freedom. The moment of freedom, Grace sat quietly in the passenger seat of Edward's car, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. The world outside was blurring past, but in her mind, everything had come to a standstill. The weight that had burdened her for so many years, the constant demands, the suffocating expectations, and the overwhelming responsibility had finally started to lift. She was free. The hospital stay had been a whirlwind of emotions, pain, and hurt. But now, as she gazed out of the window at the rolling hills and endless stretches of countryside, there was a sense of peace she hadn't known in ages. She could feel it deep in her bones, a quiet stillness that wasn't filled with worry or resentment. It was a sense of release. The pain from her injuries still lingered in her body, but her spirit was lighter than it had been in years. Edward's hand reached out to hers, his fingers warm and steady. He didn't say anything, but his presence beside her was a comfort. For so long, Grace had been living for everyone else, Emily, Lucas, even Lydia. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she was living for herself. Edward had always been there for her, a steady rock in the chaos of their lives. But even he couldn't shield her from the constant emotional toll that came with being a mother, a grandmother, and a caregiver, all while being overlooked and taken for granted. Now, it felt as though a door had opened, and she was stepping through it, leaving the past behind. The journey to their new home was quiet, but it was also filled with a sense of anticipation. Grace knew that her life was about to change forever. They had talked about moving to a quiet cottage by the coast for years, but it always seemed like something they would do someday, when the time was right. But now, with all that had happened, it felt like the right time had finally come. The daydreams of a peaceful life, away from the drama and stress, were about to become a reality. And with Edward by her side, it felt like they were embarking on a new chapter, one where they could finally put themselves first. As they arrived at the cottage, Grace took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air that carried the scent of the ocean. It was everything they had hoped for: serene, beautiful, and secluded. The little house nestled at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast expanse of water. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was calming, like a lullaby that promised peace and tranquility. The cottage itself was small but cozy, with a fireplace that invited warmth and comfort. It was the perfect place to heal, both physically and emotionally. Edward helped Grace out of the car, his hand gently guiding her as she took in the view. It was as if the world had paused, allowing her to truly see it for the first time. She had spent so many years feeling like she was merely going through the motions, but now, with the sea stretching out before her, everything felt alive. The colors of the sky at dusk, the soft rustle of the trees in the breeze, it was all so simple, yet so profound. In that moment, Grace realized that she had been so focused on taking care of everyone else, she had forgotten what it meant to take care of herself. They moved into the cottage, and Edward immediately started setting up their home. He unpacked the boxes, setting everything in its place, while Grace sat by the window, watching the waves. For the first time in ages, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. There was no rush, no pressure, no one to take care of but herself. The weight of the world had lifted, and she felt lighter, freer, than she ever had before. As the evening settled in, Grace and Edward sat down to dinner, just the two of them. There was no grand celebration, no fancy feast. But there was something infinitely more precious: peace. The food was simple, a homemade soup, and a loaf of freshly baked bread, but it tasted like freedom. The conversation flowed easily, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. They didn't need to speak much to understand each other. Edward's gentle smile said everything she needed to know. They were finally in a place where they could just be together, without the complications of the past. Later, as they sat outside on the porch, watching the stars come out over the ocean, Grace felt a sense of gratitude she hadn't felt in a long time. She had survived, and now she was free. It wasn't just the physical distance from her old life that made her feel liberated. It was the emotional distance, too. For years, she had been carrying the weight of her family's expectations and demands. She had been drowning in the role she had played: mother, grandmother, caregiver, never stopping to ask what she wanted, what she needed. But now, in this quiet cottage by the sea, she was beginning to rediscover herself. Edward turned to her, his eyes soft. "We're here now," he said quietly. "This is our time. No more living for anyone else." Grace nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. This was the life they had always wanted, a life where they could live for themselves. No more sacrifices, no more being taken for granted. They were starting fresh, and Grace could already feel the changes within herself. She was no longer the person who had given everything and received nothing in return. She was someone who had learned to put herself first, someone who had finally found the courage to walk away from the chaos. As they sat together, wrapped in the warmth of the evening and the love they shared, Grace knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. She had lived for others for so long, but now, for the first time, she was living for herself. And in doing so, she had found the freedom she had longed for. The journey ahead was hers to write, and she was ready to embrace it, one peaceful step at a time. The final straw. Grace had hoped for peace after her departure from the hospital, after years of sacrificing her own well-being for the sake of her family. The quiet of their new home by the coast, the sense of freedom she felt, was something she had dreamed of for so long. But just as quickly as the calm had settled in, it was shattered. The peace she had fought so hard for was short-lived, and it came in a way she least expected, through the screen of her phone. It began innocuously enough, with a notification on her phone, a post from Emily. Grace's heart sank as she read the words. Emily had posted a video, one that painted a picture of Grace as a cold, heartless mother who had abandoned her daughter and grandson in their time of need. Grace watched, stunned, as Emily's words, full of manipulation and deceit, spread across social media like wildfire. The video was framed to show Emily sitting in the dim light of their old home, surrounded by the clutter of life. She looked every bit the part of a struggling single mother, lamenting how her life had been turned upside down, how she had been left to fend for herself, with no one to turn to. Her voice trembled as she spoke of how her mother had walked away without a care, leaving her and Benny behind to fend for themselves. There were tears, moments of dramatic silence, and a string of accusations that felt as though they had been rehearsed. But what struck Grace the most wasn't just the lies, it was the blatant attempt to garner sympathy from strangers, to manipulate the online world into believing a narrative that was so far from the truth. Emily went on to post several more videos over the next few days. One particularly devastating video showed Emily in the darkened kitchen, claiming she had no food in the house and that she was struggling to make ends meet. She showed empty cupboards and an apparently empty fridge, highlighting how dire her situation was. Grace knew the truth. The cupboards hadn't been empty when she left. Emily had more than enough to get by. But now, in a desperate attempt to create a facade of hardship, Emily was spinning a story of destitution. The more Emily posted, the more the story spread, and soon Grace's name was being dragged through the mud. Emily's online campaign didn't stop there. She posted photos of Grace and Edward enjoying their vacation, laughing on a beach, carefree and relaxed. She juxtaposed these images with captions that dripped with sarcasm, implying that Grace and Edward had abandoned her, that they had gone off to enjoy themselves while Emily and Benny were left to suffer. The narrative she was building, the lies she was spinning, were becoming increasingly elaborate, designed to garner pity from anyone who would listen. But Grace had reached her limit. The manipulation, the lies, it was all too much. She had been silent for so long, swallowed her pride and her hurt, let her daughter and son-in-law walk all over her. But now, as the lies began to spread, as her reputation was being tarnished in front of strangers, she could no longer remain silent. She had fought so hard to create a peaceful life for herself and Edward, and now Emily was threatening to destroy everything with nothing but a few clicks of a button. Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she picked up her phone. She knew what she had to do, and she wasn't about to let Emily's lies stand without a response. It was time for the truth to be heard. She opened the camera on her phone and began recording. Her voice was steady, though there was a fire in her eyes. My name is Grace Brooks, and I am the mother that Emily has been slandering online. If you've seen the videos she's posted, you've heard her tell lies, you've heard her play the victim. But the truth is, I did everything I could for my daughter and her family. I spent years taking care of Emily, doing everything she asked, never once asking for anything in return. I cared for Benny, cooked meals, cleaned, helped with finances, and when I was injured, all I received was blame. Her words were calm but firm, each one carrying the weight of years of selflessness, years of dedication. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she continued. I've spent my life being a mother, and I thought that's what I was supposed to do. But no one told me that sometimes, the hardest thing a mother can do is to put herself first. I've done enough. I've given enough. And now, it's time for me to live for myself. Grace paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. She had been silent for so long, but now, she was speaking her truth. She was no longer hiding behind the walls of sacrifice. She was stepping into the light of her own life, reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped away from her for so long. In the videos my daughter has posted, she's telling a version of the story that isn't true, Grace went on. She's making it seem as though I abandoned her and my grandson. But the truth is, I left because I had no other choice. I gave everything I had, and it was never enough. I was nothing more than a servant in her home, and I was expected to stay there, to keep giving, no matter the cost to my own health or happiness. When I finally decided to leave, when I decided to put myself first, Emily turned against me. She used our family's story to manipulate others, to make me look like the villain. But I am not the villain in this story. Grace's voice quivered slightly, but she held her head high. I am a mother, yes, but I am also a woman. I am someone who deserves respect, someone who deserves to live her own life. I don't owe anyone anything anymore. I've done my part, and I won't be shamed into silence any longer. She paused the video, taking a deep breath before pressing the upload button. The words she had spoken felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but she knew that the fight wasn't over. She wasn't just defending her reputation, she was reclaiming her dignity. As the video went live, Grace sat back, waiting for the responses to roll in. She wasn't sure what the world would say, but she knew one thing for sure: she had finally found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her again. The reckoning, the final straw had been pulled, and Grace was no longer willing to remain silent. For years, she had lived for others: her daughter, her son-in-law, her grandson. She had poured every ounce of herself into caring for Emily and her family, yet all she had ever received in return was exploitation, resentment, and betrayal. No more. Grace had reached a breaking point, and in the silence of her new life with Edward, she found the courage to reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from her. Sitting in the peaceful cottage by the coast, with the gentle sound of waves crashing in the distance and the soft scent of the salty air around her, Grace prepared herself for a battle. She had been passive for too long. Now, the world would hear her side of the story, and they would understand the depth of her sacrifice. Grace sat in front of her phone, the camera rolling as she took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength that came through. She was telling the world the truth, her truth. I am Grace Brooks, and I am a mother who has been used, taken advantage of, and disrespected by my own daughter, Grace began. Her words were not those of a victim, but of someone who had been pushed to the edge and was finally ready to stand her ground. I've spent my entire life raising my children, doing everything I could for them. But no one told me that sometimes the hardest thing to do as a mother is to say no, to say, I've done enough. Her hand shook slightly as she continued, but Grace pressed on. For years, I've cooked their meals, cleaned their house, taken care of my grandson without a single thank you. I've sacrificed my own time, my own health, all to make sure my daughter's family was well taken care of. But what did I get in return? I got nothing but disrespect, demands, and blame. Grace's voice faltered for just a moment, but she quickly composed herself. When I got hurt, when I shielded my grandson from harm, what did I get? I got blame. I got accusations. Emily didn't even care that I was lying there, injured, in pain. All she cared about was making sure her son was okay and ignoring the fact that her own mother was the one who had taken the brunt of the crash. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she recalled the moment Emily had dismissed her pain, demanding that the doctors focus only on her grandson and not her. It stung more than anything else. For so many years, Grace had been there for Emily, always ready to help, always sacrificing her own happiness for her family. But when she needed her daughter the most, Emily was nowhere to be found. Instead, Grace was left alone, in the hands of medical staff, while her daughter turned her back on her. But this time, I'm not staying silent, Grace continued. This time, the world will know the truth. My daughter, she used me. She used me for years, and I allowed it. I allowed myself to be her maid, her nanny, her caregiver. And in return, she never once showed me the respect I deserved. Grace took a deep breath before she spoke again. The moment Emily demanded my pension card, my own hard-earned money, the money I'd worked for all my life, was the moment I realized I had spent too many years living for others. She wanted to control me, to use my money to maintain the life she had built on my sacrifices. But I was done. I gave it to her, yes, but only because I wanted to make it clear that I would no longer be controlled. I would no longer allow her to manipulate me. With every word, Grace felt more powerful, more liberated. The weight she had carried for so long was slowly lifting, piece by piece. And now, the truth is out. The world knows what I've done for Emily. They know how much I've given. They know how little I've received in return. And the manipulation she's been spreading online, painting me as the villain, well, it's all falling apart. People are finally seeing the truth. They're seeing through her lies. As she spoke, Grace's resolve grew stronger. She was no longer the woman who had been silenced by guilt or shame. She was a woman who had been wronged, who had been taken advantage of, but who was finally ready to take control of her own life again. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had ever been exploited, for every person who had ever been made to feel small by those they loved. And the truth doesn't stop here, Grace added, her voice firm with conviction. Edward and I are taking action. We're filing legal proceedings against Emily. For the years of emotional manipulation, for the way she used me, for everything she did to make me feel like I was nothing more than a tool for her convenience. She needs to face the consequences of her actions. Grace paused, her eyes steely with determination. I don't care what Emily says or what anyone else thinks. I'm not going to sit quietly while she spreads lies. I've spent too many years putting everyone else first. It's time for me to take back control of my life, to demand the respect I deserve. And if that means standing up to my own daughter, then so be it. As the video ended, Grace felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had finally told the truth, and now the world would know. The manipulation, the lies, the control, they couldn't hurt her anymore. She wasn't the villain in this story. She was the woman who had given everything for her family, only to be betrayed in the end. But now, she was reclaiming her dignity, her peace, and her future. The next step was filing the legal actions. Grace knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, there would be obstacles. But she was ready for them. She had taken the first step toward her new life, and nothing would hold her back now. The final break, Grace sat quietly in the comfortable warmth of her new home, surrounded by the peace she had long been denied. Edward, her loving husband, had been by her side throughout everything, offering unwavering support as they slowly built their life together after years of turmoil. The peacefulness of their new life felt like a distant memory from the chaos she had endured. Yet, even now, there were moments when the scars of the past resurfaced. Grace had always believed that family was something sacred, a bond that should not be broken. But that belief had been shattered, piece by piece, by her own daughter's betrayal. It had started with the lies, the manipulation, and the emotional disregard from Emily. But nothing could have prepared Grace for what would happen next, the ultimate betrayal that would finally push her to cut ties with her daughter for good. It all began when Grace returned home one evening after a peaceful walk with Edward, only to find their front door ajar. The sense of unease that washed over her was instant, and her heart began to race. As Grace stepped inside the house, the first thing that hit her was the silence. It was far too quiet. Her eyes immediately scanned the room, taking in the disarray, the overturned furniture, the broken glass scattered across the floor. Her stomach churned. Someone had been here, and not just anyone. It was clear this was no random break-in. This was personal. The mess spoke volumes, and it took only a few seconds for the horrible truth to sink in. Her daughter, Emily, and her son-in-law, Andrew, had ransacked their home. Grace's knees buckled as the realization hit her. The pain in her chest was sharp, deeper than any physical wound. This was not just an invasion of her home. It was an invasion of her trust, her love, and her loyalty. The people she had loved unconditionally, who she had sacrificed everything for, had crossed a line that no mother should ever have to endure. As Grace began to take in the full extent of the damage, she noticed her prized possessions had been taken, her jewelry, her favorite antique furniture, and personal items that had sentimental value, things that could never be replaced. Everything was strewn about the house, broken and discarded like it was all meaningless. The pain that gripped her heart was overwhelming. How had her daughter, the very person she had raised with love and care, come to this? How had Emily turned so cold, so calculating, so willing to steal from her own mother? Without thinking, Grace reached for the phone that had sat abandoned on the table. Her hand shook as she dialed 911. "I need to report a break-in," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "My daughter and son-in-law have broken into my home and stolen from us. Please send someone right away." As she waited for the authorities to arrive, Grace's mind was flooded with memories of the years she had spent raising Emily. The sacrifices she had made, the sleepless nights, the countless times she had put her daughter's needs before her own. How had it all come to this? What had she done to deserve this betrayal? The police arrived swiftly, and as they took stock of the situation, Grace found herself struggling to hold back tears. Not because of the material loss, but because of the emotional devastation. She had given everything for her family only to be repaid with such coldness and cruelty. It was in that moment, surrounded by the remnants of her broken home, that Grace knew she could no longer allow herself to be treated this way. The arrest of Lydia and Andrew was swift. They were taken away by the police, their actions having gone too far. For the first time in years, Grace felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The people who had been tearing her down, using her, and taking advantage of her love were finally facing the consequences of their actions. The grip they had on her life was now broken. Grace stood alone in the now quiet home, the chaos finally beginning to settle. Emily's betrayal had reached a new low, one that Grace could no longer ignore. "You've crossed a line," Grace muttered under her breath, the weight of those words settling heavily on her heart. She had given Emily every opportunity to change, to see the damage she was causing, but Emily had refused to listen. Now, Grace had no choice but to accept that her daughter was no longer the person she had raised. The thought of cutting ties with her own flesh and blood was one Grace had never imagined. But in that moment, standing amidst the wreckage of her home, she realized it was the only choice left. For too long, she had been living in the shadows of her daughter's demands, her manipulation, and her disregard for everything Grace had sacrificed. It was time to stop. It was time to put herself first. When Grace looked up from the devastation, her eyes found Edward's. He was standing in the doorway, watching her with concern and empathy. He didn't need to say anything. Grace knew what he was thinking. He had been by her side through it all, always ready to support her, always ready to protect her. Edward had never asked anything of her but love and companionship, and now they were finally free to live their lives on their own terms. Grace took a deep breath, her heart heavy but resolute. "I'm done, Edward," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm done trying to make it work with Emily. I've spent my whole life trying to be the mother she wanted me to be. But now, I realize I've been ignoring myself for far too long. It's time to let go." Edward walked over to her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You deserve peace, Grace," he said softly. "And I'll be here, always, by your side. We can start fresh together." With those words, Grace felt a new sense of strength begin to bloom within her. The anger, the hurt, the years of feeling unappreciated, they were finally starting to fade. She had made her choice. She would no longer allow herself to be used, to be manipulated, or to be taken for granted. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. As Grace and Edward sat down together, surrounded by the broken remnants of their old life, they knew that this was just the beginning. It wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face whatever came next. They had each other, and that was enough. The journey ahead would be theirs to make, on their own terms. Grace had finally taken the first step toward healing, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way again. This was the final break, the end of a chapter, and the beginning of something new. And Grace was finally free. The aftermath, the transition from a life marked by emotional turmoil and unrelenting demands to one of peaceful solitude and freedom, was nothing short of transformative for Grace and Edward. They had spent years trapped in the chaos of family obligations, always putting others first, always sacrificing their own happiness for the sake of people who never seemed to appreciate it. Now, with Emily's manipulations and expectations finally behind them, they found themselves embarking on a new chapter, one where their only responsibility was to each other and to themselves. It wasn't an easy decision to cut ties with Emily, the daughter they had loved and nurtured for so many years. The pain of that decision lingered, but it was overshadowed by the relief that came with finally being free from the toxic cycle that had dominated their lives. Emily's betrayal had left deep scars on Grace's heart, but those scars were slowly starting to heal as she and Edward began to rebuild their lives together. They settled in a small, quiet town, far from the hustle and bustle of their former life. It was a place that seemed untouched by the chaos they had endured. The people here were kind, unhurried, and unpretentious. Grace and Edward quickly found their place among a community that valued the simple joys of life. They joined local hiking groups, enjoying the peace of the mountains, the crisp air, and the serenity that had eluded them for so long. For the first time in years, Grace felt a sense of calm settle over her. There were no more demands to meet, no more tears to hide, no more expectations to live up to. She had spent so many years living for others, giving without receiving, loving without being loved in return. But now, for the first time, she was living for herself. She was able to savor the small moments, the quiet mornings, the leisurely walks with Edward, the evenings spent sitting on their porch, watching the sunset as they shared stories of their past. The stress that had weighed heavily on Grace's shoulders for so long began to lift. She no longer had to worry about the constant calls and messages from Emily, demanding money or help with the grandson she had always put above her mother. Instead, Grace was able to focus on her own well-being, taking the time to recover from her injuries, both physical and emotional. The doctors had told her that she was healing well, but the healing of her heart was something only time could mend. Edward was there every step of the way, a constant source of support and love. His unwavering devotion to her was a reminder of the strength of their bond, and Grace realized how much she had taken it for granted in the past. Edward had always been there, quietly standing by her side, offering his love without expectation. He never once asked for anything in return, and in his quiet way, he had given Grace the love and respect she had longed for from others. Together, they built a life that was filled with the peace they had always dreamed of but had never known. As they explored their new surroundings, Grace and Edward found themselves rediscovering the simple pleasures of life. They hiked along nature trails, hand in hand, marveling at the beauty of the world around them. They visited local markets, enjoying the fresh produce and homemade goods, and shared meals with new friends who welcomed them with open arms. There were no more arguments, no more tension, no more toxic relationships. Just a quiet, contented existence. Grace found joy in the small things like taking the time to read books she had put off for years, or simply sitting outside with Edward, listening to the sounds of the birds and the rustling of the leaves. There was no pressure to be anything other than who she was. For the first time in a long time, Grace was able to relax and embrace the life she and Edward had built together. One of the things Grace appreciated most was the freedom to make her own choices without feeling guilty or obligated to anyone. She no longer had to justify her actions or explain herself. The weight of Emily's constant demands was no longer a burden on her shoulders. She could finally do the things that made her happy, without fear of judgment or manipulation. Edward, too, thrived in this new environment. He had always been a man of few words, but in the quiet of their new home, he found peace in the simplicity of their life. He often spoke about how much he appreciated their time together, away from the chaos of the past. There were no more financial struggles, no more arguments over bills or unpaid debts. They were free to enjoy each other's company and the life they had created together. As the months passed, Grace's healing continued. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, began to fade. She realized that, although the wounds would never fully disappear, they no longer controlled her. She had taken back her power, and in doing so, she had regained her sense of self. She was no longer a victim of Emily's manipulation or anyone else's expectations. She was free to live her life on her own terms. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly happy. She had learned the value of self-care, of setting boundaries, and of living authentically. She had learned that sometimes, letting go of the people who hurt you is the best way to take care of yourself. And though it had taken years to get to this point, she was grateful for the lesson, painful as it had been. Grace and Edward's new life was everything they had hoped for, a life of peace, freedom, and love. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they created a life that was rich in joy, free from the toxic grip of the past. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt a deep sense of contentment. They knew that the road ahead might not always be easy, but they were ready to face whatever came their way, together. They had learned that sometimes, the hardest decisions lead to the greatest rewards. And in their case, the reward was the freedom to live their life on their own terms, at long last. The unexpected call. For weeks, Grace and Edward had been living in the peace they had longed for. far away from the toxic clutches of their past. The tranquility of their new life in the small town by the coast had become everything Grace had dreamed of. They woke up each morning with the freedom to enjoy their time together, without the looming presence of guilt or obligation. The weight of the past, the years spent caring for Emily and her family, had finally been lifted. Grace had learned the hard way that sometimes you have to put yourself first, and that was exactly what she was doing now. Yet, just as Grace was beginning to fully embrace her newfound freedom, the phone rang. It was a sound that, in the past, had always been a reminder of her duties, her responsibilities, and the people who demanded so much of her. This time, however, it felt different, more like an intrusion into the peaceful life she had finally found. "Hello," Grace answered, her voice steady but guarded, already sensing what was to come. "Mom, I don't know what to do." Emily's voice cracked through the phone, thick with emotion. "Everything's falling apart. I don't know how to fix it. I'm losing everything. I need your help." Grace's stomach twisted at the sound of her daughter's desperation. There was a time when this kind of phone call would have sent Grace rushing to Emily's side, ready to offer help without question. But not this time. Her mind raced. Memories of the years she had spent giving and giving to Emily, only to be met with coldness, disrespect, and manipulation flashing before her eyes. The sacrifices, the endless hours of caregiving, the emotional toll it had taken on her, none of it had ever been appreciated. In fact, it had been twisted against her, used as a tool to control her. Emily had never seen Grace as a person with needs or desires of her own. To her, Grace was nothing more than a servant, someone to do the dirty work, to pick up the pieces of her broken life, without ever asking for anything in return. The phone call was just another attempt to reel Grace back into that toxic cycle, a cycle she had worked so hard to break free from. For a moment, Grace felt the familiar tug of guilt, the instinct to jump into action and try to fix everything for Emily. But then, she remembered. She remembered the pain, the manipulation, the years she had spent sacrificing her own happiness for someone who never appreciated it. She had already given enough. "I'm sorry, Emily," Grace said, her voice firm, despite the emotions stirring within her. "I can't help you this time. I've done everything I can, and I'm not going to put myself through this again." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Grace could hear Emily's breathing, heavy and uneven, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken accusation. But Grace held her ground. She knew this was the moment she had to stand up for herself, to finally draw a line in the sand. "Mom, please." Emily's voice softened, her tone desperate now, pleading. "I don't have anyone else. You're my only hope. If you don't help me, I don't know what I'll do." Grace's heart ached, but she refused to let herself be swayed. She had spent too many years letting Emily dictate her life, letting her daughter's demands dictate her happiness. She had always believed that family came first, that love meant always being there for each other, no matter what. But now she knew better. Sometimes, love meant letting go. "Emily," Grace said quietly, her voice steady. "I love you, but I've spent too long putting your needs above my own. I can't keep doing this. You're an adult now, and you have to take responsibility for your own life. I've done everything I can for you, and now it's time for me to focus on myself." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything Grace had endured. She could feel the tension on the other end of the line, the disbelief, the hurt, and the anger. She knew Emily wouldn't understand. She knew this wouldn't be the response Emily was hoping for. But Grace also knew that this was the only way she could move forward. "I've spent too many years giving and giving, and I've ended up with nothing," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've put myself last for far too long, and I won't do it anymore. I'm not your backup plan, Emily. I'm not your safety net. It's time for me to live my life for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could almost feel the shock radiating through the phone, the realization settling in that she wasn't going to rescue her this time. But it wasn't just Emily who needed to learn that lesson, it was Grace herself. She had spent too much of her life putting everyone else first, neglecting her own needs and desires. Now, it was time to reclaim her life. "I'm sorry you're going through this, but I can't be the one to fix it for you anymore," Grace said, her voice softening with a finality that she hadn't allowed herself before. "You'll have to figure it out on your own." With that, she hung up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she sat there, stunned by the weight of what she had just done. But then, something incredible happened. The tightness in her chest loosened. The weight of guilt that had always followed her began to dissipate. She had done something she had never done before. She had put herself first. Grace didn't feel relief immediately. The old patterns, the old guilt, tried to creep back in, but she fought them. She knew this was the right choice. She had made it for herself, for her peace of mind, for her happiness. And though she wasn't sure what would come next, she was certain of one thing. She was finally free. The phone call with Emily had been the final test, the final tug back into the chaos that had defined Grace's life for far too long. But this time, she had refused to be pulled back. She had learned that family, no matter how much you love them, can be toxic. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away. As Grace set the phone down and looked at Edward, she saw the understanding in his eyes. He had been her rock throughout all of this, and now, together, they could continue to build the life they had always wanted. A life where they were no longer weighed down by the demands of others. A life where they could breathe freely, without guilt or obligation. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly free. The new chapter, Grace and Edward had always been a team, navigating life's challenges together with love and mutual support. But the years of constant sacrifice had worn them both down. Grace had spent so much time caring for others, putting her daughter, Emily, and her family before her own needs that she had forgotten how to live for herself. Every day had been about fulfilling someone else's expectations, and every sacrifice felt like another layer of weight that she carried in silence. But now, with Emily and her toxic behavior behind them, Grace and Edward were finally breathing freely again. They were no longer bound by the unspoken demands of family members who took but never gave. They were no longer trapped in a never-ending cycle of emotional exhaustion and disappointment. For the first time in years, they had time to themselves, a time where they could rediscover the joy of being together without the burdens of guilt, manipulation, and fear. They had moved to a peaceful town by the coast, where the air was fresh and the rhythm of life was slower. The town was small but welcoming, a place where everyone knew everyone, but no one expected anything from anyone. It was a perfect escape, far removed from the chaos and toxicity that had once defined Grace's life. In the mornings, they took long walks along the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore soothing their souls. They would sit together on the porch of their cozy cottage, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise, savoring the quiet moments that had once seemed so elusive. Grace had started to realize that for so many years, she had been living in a way that was dictated by others. She had thought that her love for her daughter, her desire to help, and her responsibility as a mother meant she had to sacrifice her own happiness. But in letting go of the toxic relationships that drained her, Grace finally understood that true love doesn't require self-sacrifice to the point of self-neglect. It didn't mean constantly putting yourself last or enduring mistreatment in silence. True love, she now knew, was about boundaries, respect, and self-care. Edward, too, had found his own sense of relief. For years, he had stood by Grace, supporting her through everything, but even he had felt the strain. He had always been the steady rock, but he had watched as Grace's health and happiness had eroded under the weight of her family's demands. Now, with the toxic relationships behind them, they could truly focus on their own well-being. They could enjoy life together again, rediscovering the joy that had been buried beneath the years of stress and strain. Grace's journey had been long and painful, but in letting go of the family dynamics that had held her hostage, she had found the freedom she never knew she needed. It wasn't easy, of course. The guilt that accompanied walking away from a daughter who had once been the center of her world still lingered at times. She sometimes questioned whether she had done the right thing, but those moments of doubt were fleeting. She now understood that protecting her peace and well-being was not selfish, it was necessary. She had spent too many years compromising her happiness for others, and it was time to reclaim her life. Her days were now filled with small, meaningful moments. She and Edward would spend hours exploring the town, visiting local markets, and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. They had rekindled their love for one another, finding joy in each other's company once again. Grace had taken up gardening, something she had always enjoyed but never had time for, and it gave her a sense of accomplishment and peace. The act of nurturing something, whether it was a flower or a vegetable, reminded her that, just like the plants she cared for, she needed attention and care too. Grace also began to reconnect with old friends, people she had lost touch with over the years as she had been consumed by family obligations. She had forgotten how much she enjoyed their company, how much laughter and joy had been missing from her life for so long. Rebuilding these relationships was like rediscovering a part of herself that she had neglected. She was no longer just a caretaker or a fixer. She was Grace, a woman with her own desires, her own passions, and her own life to live. There were still moments when Grace would think about Emily. The years of mothering, the sacrifices, the hope that things could have been different, those memories would never completely fade. But she no longer carried the weight of them. She had let go of the past and embraced the present, knowing that her peace and happiness were worth more than the toxic ties that had once defined her. The truth was, Grace had finally learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot pour from an empty cup. For years, she had poured herself out for others, without ever filling herself back up. But now, she was taking the time to refill her own cup. She was putting herself first, and in doing so, she was better able to love those who truly mattered in her life, like Edward and even herself. Their new life was a testament to the strength they had found in each other. They had come through the storm of family drama, manipulation, and guilt, and had emerged on the other side stronger and more connected. They had weathered the storm together, and now they were free to enjoy the calm. Grace could now say, with conviction, that she had learned the true meaning of self-love, and that she was no longer willing to sacrifice her happiness for the sake of others. As she and Edward sat together one evening on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Grace felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. This was the life she had always dreamed of, the life she had finally allowed herself to have. No longer defined by the demands of others, Grace had found her peace, her freedom, and her happiness. It was a new chapter, and it was hers to write. One of the most profound lessons from Grace's journey is the importance of setting boundaries and prioritizing your own well-being, especially as we age. Throughout her life, Grace sacrificed her own happiness to meet the demands of others, particularly her daughter. But as she let go of the toxic relationships that drained her, she discovered the power of self-care. This is a crucial message for everyone, particularly older adults. It's easy to feel obligated to put others first, but true love and care begin with loving and caring for yourself. The ability to let go of relationships that no longer serve you, to choose peace over conflict, and to reclaim your joy is a gift you can give yourself at any age. Life may bring challenges and difficult decisions, but remember that your health, both physical and emotional, must come first. Just as Grace found peace after letting go, we too can find fulfillment in nurturing our own well-being. The most important relationship we can have is with ourselves, and it's never too late to begin a new chapter, free from guilt and the weight of others' expectations. Thank you so much for watching this video on Stories TH. We hope Grace's full story has inspired you to reflect on your own life and the importance of setting boundaries. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Stay tuned for more powerful, heartfelt content.